hour. That includes a 15 minutes Q&A. You can post your queries within the Q&A box, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. All participants will be muted during the entire session. The session is being recorded and will be available in the Informatica Support YouTube channel and the Success portal, where you'll be able to download the slide deck as well. Please feel free to put in your feedbacks and suggestions for the session in the post-webinar survey. Success Portal is a microlearning platform that offers free and unlimited learning to all registered users. This feature-rich platform helps you learn and use Informatica products better. Here are a few important links that you can go over later that will help you in your product adoption journey with Informatica. Over to you, Matt. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. This is Matt Morgan with IPS. Thanks for joining. This webinar is to talk about reference data management with Informatica Cloud Native MDM, the new Reference 360 SaaS offering. In this session, we'll talk about what we mean by reference data, how it differs from master data. We'll also talk about how it can be managed across the enterprise, some of the terminology in Informatica's Reference 360 product. We'll show a reference data architecture and how it can be employed across the enterprise. We'll show how to do data modeling and some data quality checks within the tool. We'll show multi-step approval workflow, roles, security. We'll talk about data integration and also best practices. So what do we mean when we say reference data? Well, across the enterprise, we can think of many different types of data. Analytics, for example, will be used for analysis, reporting, visualization. We've got transactional data, which is really the operational heart of any enterprise, actions and events. And we've got master data, which you could think of as being people and places and things. So a transaction might be a person doing something in a place, buying a thing. Whereas reference data might be standards, lookups, classifications, categorization, cross-references from legacy codes. They're all dependent. So analytics, just as analytics are dependent on transactions, master data is dependent on reference data. Even metadata, we could think of all of these as being dependent on metadata. What is the structure of the data? What's the security attached to that data? What's its retention time, data volumes, data dictionaries? And then, of course, unstructured data, which might be videos like we're looking at today or in images, but also might be legal documents like contracts, invoices, standard operating procedures. We could think of supplier qualifications, and you might want to have, for example, you could have a supplier qualification as part of your supplier master data. So perhaps you have a vendor that needs to be renewed on their qualification to haul either freight or radioactive waste. You can attach that document to your master data. In our case, we're interested in reference data. The management of reference data is quite similar to how master data is managed. We still have data that needs to be maintained and changes need to be approved by subject matter experts, but often for reference data, the approvals and security can be simplified. For example, a new supplier may need to be approved by multiple purchasing groups, depending on where they're located, as well as what products and services they offer, how they should be categorized, what are their location addresses and contact information. They may have private tax information such as SSN, which can't be seen by everyone across the enterprise, and a company's supplier list would typically be seen as confidential. So that's master data. By contrast, in reference data, we might have a list of countries and states, industry classifications, standards, categorizations that are used by many applications, not just, say, supply chain and finance, and they may be pulled from public sources such as the ISO, Changes might require only a small approval workflow, such as 1 or 2 people, and the data may or may not be considered confidential. So what are some examples of reference data? And how is it different to master data? Well, for reference data, you can see reference data is very similar. From a technical point of view, a lot of the management is the same, but generally speaking, it has smaller data volumes, less complexity, a larger ecosystem with more dependent applications, and fewer security or privacy needs, often public information. So we talked about suppliers being an example of master data, customers, products, employees and contractors, assets, equipment, office facilities, warehouse locations. Those are all examples of master data. Whereas for reference data, we could think of countries, states, geographical regions, sales regions, regulatory jurisdictions. All of that is reference data because it might be used by multiple applications for multiple purposes across the enterprise. You might also want to have your own company's brands, sub-brands, types, form factors, units of measure. We can talk about product lines and product groups, material classifications, rather than specific individual products. That would integrate well with the master data, for example. So you might have product 360 managing the actual products, but reference data managing the product lines and groups. Marketing segments, industry sectors, and distribution channels are all examples of reference data as well. Underneath the covers, Business 360 is a microservice-based architecture, including many industry standards such as Spark processing, MongoDB for document storage, Kubernetes for scalability, and of course our proprietary Claire artificial intelligence engine. Next, I'd like to talk a bit about the terminology that we use with Reference 360. We have reference data sets. Those are the basic object within Reference 360. Might contain a category such as a country code lists or currency lists. It can be hierarchical or flat. It might be dependent on other reference data sets, like, for example, for country and state relationship. We'll see an example of that in a few minutes. And then code lists exist within a reference data set. So a reference data set is a set of code lists. Those are a set of values for a particular application. Those code values all have to be unique, such as they'll need to contain a business term, such as a name, a code, or lookup value, and perhaps a description. You can also add additional columns or attributes, such as a description, or such as dependencies and so on. Then you can define a crosswalk between code lists. So if you have a legacy system and you're bringing in a new ERP, then you may want a way of converting between the different code lists in those systems. You can show hierarchies such as world, region, country, sales area, state, city, and so this helps your data warehouse, for example, to allow roll-ups and break down sales by regions. You can also include approval workflows. In Reference 360, those can be a single-step workflow or a multi-step workflow. Finally, we have enums or pick lists, which are static values that are used as lookups within our 360. And we'll see an example of that in the demo. Some examples are status, confidentiality, and applications. Those can be set to any value that makes sense for your organization. Let's take a look at Reference 360 itself. So here we'll log into the IICS portal. And from these applets that we have access to, I'm going to select the Reference 360. So here we see the home screen for Reference 360. This includes a quick video on what's new in the current release. And so this for us is June 2022. And the previous release, May 2022, is also here. It also can give you a quick introduction to Reference 360 and some basic help. All of these videos are language independent. They're just music. So let's take a look at some of the data sets that have been defined in this org. I'm having a look at the countries data set. Here you can see we've got enterprise countries that are defined by a numeric code, and we've also got countries that are defined by the 3-character ISO code. So because of that, we've got a crosswalk that goes between these two lists, shows the equivalencies. So we've got one data set, 2 code lists, and a crosswalk between them. You can see the red arrow and the blue arrow, they're the same data set, they just go in different directions. We can also take a look at the currency table. So here we see a currency reference data set that has a single codeless enterprise currency. And this is an example of a dependent data set because the 3-digit code here is the 3-digit code of the currency, but each one is dependent on a single country. In this case, that's defined by a foreign key relationship, just as if we were designing a database. We can also take a look at a dependent relationship, such as state, where in the case of the state, it's the other way around. It's not a foreign key, it's a dependency. So for example, we have Buenos Aires as a state with a state code of B, which has a dependency of being in Argentina. And you can see that the state code is always unique because even though this is a dependent table, you would expect, for example, UAE would all be unique. The uniqueness should be within this country. But in fact, this is enforced to be a unique code across the board, so for all countries. And for that leads to issues. For example, Connecticut CT has, there's also a state in India that has the abbreviation CT. So in order to have both in the same table, even though they have different dependency, different currency, different country dependency, we still need to define each code value with a unique indicator on the front. That's why we do it this way. Let's take a look at creating a new asset. We're going to create a new reference data set. I'll give it a name of countries. By best practice, we want to include a description. Now these other fields here, you can define these through pick lists to be whatever you like them to be. So for example, I'm going to say that countries are part of the geography domain. And I'm going to say that this is not confidential. This is public information because it comes from the ISO. And you can define a default priority to changes to this list. We'll also say that this list is complete. One trick here is we don't want to immediately hit save. We want to go to the definition first. And the reason for that is that there are some fields here, such as hierarchical or dependent checkboxes, that you can't change once it has been saved. So for the countries, we don't need to worry about that. So we'll leave those as they are. We'll say the display attribute that we want to show on the screen as the is in terms of the uniqueness is name. And then we can define also if we want particular stakeholders to be defined. We can say here by default, it's including me as the primary stakeholder, primary owner and stakeholder, but you can add additional people here. That's all we need to do. Now that the demo countries data set has been created, by default, it includes an enterprise data set, an enterprise code list, which has not yet been populated. All of the values are blank, but let's take an import from a CSV file. We can import, for example, from here. By default, you can see it starts to load this file. In this case, even though it's a CSV file, I'm actually using a semicolon to delimit the different fields, just because there are some countries that have a comma in them, or there might be. Like, for example, North Korea, Democratic Republic of, something like that. So it detects that automatically. This import is fairly smart. It'll detect whether you're using double quotes or not, which code page you're using, and so on. You can change that if it gets it wrong. I'll click next. You can see here, this is an intelligent way of determining which fields map to which of the code list columns. So the source columns that I have defined in this file are just name, code, description, and it's automatically found that name, code, description also matches with what we have in this particular reference data set. So it's made those suggestions and smart mapping has been applied. And you could also add a status and an effective date if you want to, but for now, we'll just accept the defaults. It shows you a quick preview just to make sure it's getting it right. And it is, so we'll continue. And it starts the import job. In order to see the status, we can go to our My Jobs tab. We'll see that this job is now running. And as it runs, you can see the data started to come in already. It gives you a status here of how many records it is successfully processed. It's found 252 rows in the file, which is correct. And it's doing some work in the background as well with other tables. So it's found 504 success rows. You can see these load jobs at stages of the loading process at the beginning here. So it's completed transform, it's completed load, looks like it's completed searching as well. Yep, and it's complete. So now if we go back to our code list, you can see that the complete set has been loaded into our new enterprise demo countries list. So let's say we wanted to now make a change. Maybe instead of Antigua and Barbados, I would like to put an and symbol, an ampersand there. So since this code list is locked, where it's now been published in the background, we can say we want to create a draft. And in this draft version, we can make our changes. Here is the code value that I'd like to change. I'm going to keep the same code and name, just going to change the description. Now that the change has been made, we can either save this and come back to it later, or we can send it for approval by a data steward. In this case, I've only defined the data steward to be me. or we can publish it. So I'm going to save. And then publish. You can see we can also compare our draft with the published version, which would highlight any changes or additions or deletes in different colors so you can quickly see exactly what's changed. And here we have our updated code list. Okay, great. So how does Reference 360 fit within the technical application infrastructure? Here is a technical example of a reference architecture that includes Reference 360 in your enterprise master data ecosystem. Here I've, of course, used Informatica's product sets, but we do have customers that are using other vendor solutions, such as Dell Boomi or MuleSoft, to do the same kind of publish-subscribe model with Reference 360. In this example, I've assumed that the organization has two pods. One integration pod that maybe they've been using for a while with other use cases, such as data lake ingestion, and one for Reference 360 SaaS on the left. So at the bottom left here, we can see the development team and administration would work to create the reference data sets, the code lists, just as we saw in the demo, assign data stewards, and define workflows. The initial data source for this reference data may be from finance in the ERP. For example, maybe a list of general ledger accounts, or supply chain and logistics, such as warehouse locations, or this data may come from a legacy system that was used previously for managing reference data, even just Excel sheets on a SharePoint that's been managed by similar teams in the past. These can be read using the IICS Secure Agent and attached to the integration pod, which then populates the code lists in Reference 360 using the REST API. The data stewards can use the same interface, which you saw in the demo, to make changes and maintain this reference data over time. Finally, on the right, the same secure agent reads the data from the code lists as they change, as they're published, either in real time using Cloud Application Integration, CAI, or in a scheduled batch job using Cloud Data Integration, CDI, and sends these changes to the Cloud Integration Hub, the CIH, for publication to subscribing applications across the enterprise. If you're used to the Data Integration Hub, the Cloud Integration Hub is the same software under the covers. It works the same way. It's just cloud enabled. So you still define CDI. You can use CAI. You can publish to the Cloud Integration Hub. You can subscribe to topics. Works very similar way. Then at the bottom here, you can see the master data from the customer MDM, product MDM, supplier MDM, which may be Informatica's on-prem products. They may be cloud-hosted products, or now the cloud-native MDM, customer 360 SaaS, supplier 360 SaaS. They can also publish and subscribe through the same mechanism, so that they can exchange, for example, lookups and other information with the reference data set in Reference 360. Let's take a look at reference data modeling in this tool. It's similar to how we would do data modeling in a database in concept. Usually it's going to be greatly simplified. Here I'm showing an easy example. This is the same example that we were looking at in the demo. So we've got a country table or reference data set with a code name and a description, and we've got also a foreign key to our currency table, which has the code name and description for each currency. You can see also we have a dependency relationship between country and state, so that we can facilitate, for example, dependent lookups in MDM, where the list of states that a user might see when they're entering data into a customer MDM might be limited to only those that are applicable to the country they say select. So that's a dependent relationship, but it's not a foreign key. It works a different way. We can also talk about hierarchies. So for example, if we want to include a code list for the NAICS list of standard industry taxonomy, which is a hierarchical list, then all we need is a code name and description, and we can define that as a ragged hierarchy or unlimited number of levels, so that we can have that hierarchical relationship as well. This is an example of that kind of hierarchy we see within these NAICS codes or SIC codes. You might see, for example, a class of construction, manufacturing, utilities. Within construction, you might see a subclass of specialty trades, civil engineering, construction of buildings. And then even within construction of buildings, you might see residential and non-residential as different groups. We switch over to reference 360. Here's an example of how that hierarchical code list might look. We've got the enterprise industry taxonomy, which is based on NAICS codes, and we've got the equivalent SIC codes as well. So for example, we were looking at the construction and say manufacturing. You can see in manufacturing, we've got only one level below manufacturing, but under construction, we've got multiple levels, such as this third level here for residential and non-residential. And that's what we mean by a ragged hierarchy. Finally, I just wanted to touch on auditing. Everything in reference 360 is tracked. So we have, on the left, we have a tab for tracking the history of everything that's changed in the code list, such as adding a new column. On the right, we have the history of the values themselves, and you can track that in a timeline. On the right, you can see a calendar here, which is, you can select the last 7 days, the last 30 days, or you can define a custom range of any kind you like. That's all tracked internally. This is a new interface that was released just in the June 2022 release, so it looks really nice. One other feature of the June 2022 release was there you can now stop load jobs in progress, which you couldn't do before. And you do have the ability to download through this icon here on the right, log files to find out if something went wrong, rather than just downloading the files themselves. So that's a good, useful feature to have. Let's now take a look at the data quality rules that can be built into Reference 360. There's two options now as of the June 22 release. There's basic rules for data entry, which you can see on the left here. They're fairly simple. Uppercase, trim, minimum, maximum length, no spaces, those kinds of rules. They're meant to interact with the UI directly, but they can't be reused when you're ingesting data through, for example, CDI. So for that reason, it's suggested to use the advanced rules, because with the advanced rules, you can use them for both. You can use them as part of your data integration system, and you can use them in the UI. So let's take a look at how that's done using the state code reference data set. You can take a look at the state codes that is loaded. That's loading everything correctly. We can see Alabama US-AL is the unique code. And AL, although that is correct, we're not defining this as being unique. So we could manually set this to be different. But this is a case where we want to take a look at our data quality rules, because now we will have the ability to define both basic and advanced data quality rules for these code values. This is a new capability that was introduced in June 2022. And what it lets you do is, as part of your definition, you can define advanced rules. So if we wanted to take a look at the basic rules, for example, for data entry on these columns, you can see we can add a I mean, it's a basic idea of there are some that are built into the system. So there's maximum, minimum, starts with, no spaces, contains, does not contain. These are pretty good as a basic set. The only issue is it doesn't allow you to reuse these as part of the data ingestion. This is only for the UI itself. So in this case, I don't want to do that. I want to use this new capability. Oh, whoops, I just want to cancel it, I'll close. There we go. And I want to define an advanced rule. And here I won't actually define it, I just want to show how to do it. If I click add, what this lets you do is define a rule specification from CDQ. So this is, if you're using CDI already, our Cloud Data Integration product, then you can also take a look at perhaps also running CDQ, Cloud Data Quality. And it works in a similar way as our IDQ on-prem product. The idea is for IDQ and CDQ both is that you define a maplet, and that can be then used as a rule specification. So for example, if I want to validate this as if it were a DUNS number, I can reuse this existing CDQ asset that comes with the product. Just click on it. And now it would treat that code value as if it were a DUNS number. You can see it lets you change the input and output fields. You have control over that. So this is useful because, as I was saying, as a basic rule specification, you don't have the ability to reuse those as part of the ingestion process. It's only useful in the UI, but an advanced rule can be, since it's defined in CDQ externally, you can use it for both in the UI and for data ingestion. So you may want to have a rule that says these two components have to be the same, like the US-CO must match with the state code value. That way it reduces the load on your data stewards. If they make a typo, then it'll be caught. Now let's talk a bit about data integration, how we get data out of reference 360. So we have REST API that's very similar to the, if you're familiar with the cloud platform REST API that we have, it provides platform independent REST API. So this way you can use CAI, you can use CDI, our products, or we have customers using, as I said, Dell Boomi and MuleSoft and others. So Reference 360 is self-contained, and it's really accessed through these API. There are others. These are just the ones that I happen to have on my Postman. So an example flow might be to get a session token through logging in with your user ID and password, get a list of pick lists, the enums that we talked about, and then patch those pick lists to include a new value. Here we can see an example of getting a session token. So I'm just logging in with my username and password, and the result JSON that we get back has a session ID with this alphanumeric token that we can use as a session ID. All we do is we plug that in as the session ID as a header object, and it can be used in other calls. For example, this one here is getting a list of the reference data sets that we have in this org. You can see the JSON response has a list of all of the reference data sets, and it includes the ID of the reference data set and also the ID of the default list, which is the enterprise list. So now if we call the export API, again, we use that same session token as the header for IDS session ID. The body for the export command is going to be just the container type. So we want code list and the container ID. So that's that default code list we were just looking at. And the result you get back is a list of all the code values within that code list. Let's take a look at how you can do this with CDI. In CDI, you can create Swagger files from the admin interface that define what the request and response needs to look like for each operation. So one limitation that we do have on our Swagger file generator is that it needs to be one operator, one operation per file. So here, for example, I'm defining 3 Swagger files, one for the login, which is the get session, one to get the list of reference data sets, and one to actually do the export. Just the same 3 API we were just looking at. And I'm going to use a flat file in this example and get the data from my temp folder. The connections we're using, each connection is using a different Swagger file, so they're all 3 different REST v2 connectors. One for the session, one for the export, one for get reference data sets. We look at this first mapping. All we're doing here is we're connecting to the source. We're running the get session API. The result of that is we get a session key back, and we're putting that into an in-out parameter. Our next mapping, we take that in-out parameter in as a session key, and we give that to the get reference data set. So get the list of reference data sets API. We can then filter the list of names and get a particular set list ID that we're interested in. And then this target is just a dummy target. The output of this is the list ID. This third one is calling the REST API to do the actual export based on that list ID and session ID coming in. And in this case, I'm writing out to the target, which is a flat file. All of this can be combined within a task flow. We can get the session key, then use that session key to get the reference data set list, filter for the list that we're interested in, and then finally use both the session key and the list ID to get the list of code values that we're interested in for that particular reference data set. We can run this mapping and we get a successful result back. Let's talk a bit about how security works in Reference 360. It's very similar to our other Informatica products, such as PowerCenter, IDQ. In IICS, you have a user, which is an individual account linked to a unique email. Reference 360's users must have an Informatica Intelligent Cloud Services user account, and that's all managed through the administration applet. A group is a collection of users, whereas a role you could think of as being a collection of privileges. A lot of the roles are built into the system, whereas the groups might be a particular working team, like a development team, administration team, a business team, or a set of data stewards. In fact, you could have distributed teams that have a data steward at multiple points within the business who all work as a team. So the user groups in Reference 360 if you're using SAML SSO, for example, they might map one-to-one with your AD groups, whereas the roles would be then assigned to those groups. So just to illustrate a little bit about what I mean by that is on the far left, you can see here we have users that are being created in Active Directory, such as Azure Active Directory, on-prem Active Directory, any other LDAP system, AWS, Google. And then through SAML SSO, those same users are created within Informatica IICS. Now, you may assign a group within AD to those users. And there's in the SAML SSO setup, you can set up those groups in IICS so that they map one-to-one. For example, if you have a development team, then you can say that this is a user who belongs in the development team. They're a contractor and they're offshore. So they'd be in a particular team or group. Now, you could then assign a developer role to that group. So now the collection of privileges on the right, Informatica gives those privileges to the development role, which is built into the system. The developer role is then assigned to the developer offshore group. Then you have the flexibility to control who gets what privileges, who can see what project folders and so on. But you also, you don't have to create all of this yourself manually. A lot of it's built in. With Reference 360, we might define a read-only role, a data steward role, or different levels of management approval. Let's take a look at that. In Reference 360, there's a number of roles that are built in. We have a primary data owner who creates the reference data set, creates the structure, assigns stakeholders, define what does the workflow look like, then passes that on to a data steward, who really the data steward would be the SME. They are assigned to the reference data set. They're responsible for governance over that code list, the crosswalks between the code lists. They need to approve changes made to the code list values. And they're able to publish their own changes. That's important. The data steward role is the only role that can publish their own changes, in addition to approving changes made by others. A stakeholder role is allowed to propose new code values, but they can't publish. They can only propose, and then a workflow kicks in. Whereas a business analyst might only need read-only access. So they want to be able to look at the reference data values, but they don't necessarily need to propose changes in terms of these roles. Finally, the planner role is only used for managing hierarchies. So for example, world, country, state. Now, here's an example of why you might want to define a multi-step workflow. At the top left here, we have a stakeholder who creates a draft, like we saw in the demo. They either change a value or they add new values, they delete some values. That is proposed as a change. So then they send this off for approval. And maybe there's a team lead for those stakeholders and they can say approve or reject. If it's rejected, then it goes back to the stakeholder and they have to work on that change and solve the issue. If it gets approved, it goes to, let's say, a safety officer. And then maybe if they approve, it goes to a regulatory officer. And then finally, it goes to the data steward. They approve and it gets published. And as soon as it gets published, then the publish subscribe systems that we have in place will pick up that change and publish them to downstream systems. So this is a more complex example, but you can see it's still relatively straightforward. It's just a chain of approve or rejects at each level. Let's talk a little bit about best practices. As you know, we've talked about best practices throughout this presentation, really, but I just wanted to give a quick summary of what this looks like. So our best practices around reference data are mostly generic, not considering any particular type of system, but we are, of course, using our Reference 360 system as an example of how it can be implemented. So from a functional point of view, you can think of the different types of data. Master data, reference data can often be treated the same way. We can think about how we organize projects and folders. We can think about different naming conventions that we could use to make things easier for our users. Generally in Reference 360, the naming conventions are pretty easy. We just use just English language names. We don't have to use any kind of prefix or something like that. But it might be useful to consider for sorting purposes. So for example, you could have a finance group and they always put fin on the front, that kind of thing. It's also a good idea to settle right up front what your pick lists, enums are going to be. So for example, if you have enterprise-wide standards for security definitions, you might want to have your confidentiality levels set to be those enterprise standards right from the front so that no one gets the idea that they can create their own. We talked about users, groups, and roles and how those integrate natively with IICS, and the roles for Reference 360 are used to control access and multi-step approval workflows. On the technical side, we have pods, orgs, and suborgs. So pods is a point of deployment. Orgs is the organization that you publish to. You have your assets there. You have your CDI, your CAI, and now Reference 360 assets. And then you can have a suborg, which inherits the licensing from the org, but everything else is independent. So you can have separate users in your suborgs from your orgs. For example, you might want a non-production org that has both your dev and test as suborgs. That way you can control easily your IPU licensing. The other thing to consider is whitelisting. We want to make sure that the firewalls are clear for these REST API to go and import and export data in and out. We talked a bit about SAML SSO and how that can be natively connected to your AD accounts and groups. We talked about a little bit about pub-sub integration, both using our own cloud integration hub or using other vendor products. From Reference 360 point of view, it doesn't matter. It's just a REST API. So we support all of that. Code promotion, all of this can be exported and then imported. So with Reference 360, you still want to have a dev and test environment so that, for example, your developers can test out more complex examples in a kind of a sandbox. They can create a hierarchy that may or may not work. They can try out different options, and then you can export those code lists and import them into a test environment for your data stewards to take a look at, and then finally into production. It's the same CI/CD process that we'd normally recommend. You can use source control for GitHub integration, GitLab, Bitbucket, Azure DevOps, but the IICS CAI and CDI assets that's usually where you'd want to apply that. Other services may not support source control. For example, Reference 360 does not at this time. Finally, I just wanted to mention log aggregation. There's a lot of logs that do collect on these secure agents. So if you're using our secure agents, you can use a log aggregation mechanism such as ELK or build your own. And then send those logs off to a common location. I was recently on a team that built something that's very similar using MongoDB. So we used a MongoDB and we're able to output those logs to Power BI and get some visualizations and dashboards. That can be really useful for your technical team. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for your time and attendance today. We'll turn this over for a quick question and answer period.
They are separate. So the reference 360 data is quite separate to the CDQ dictionaries, but you could imagine a publishing process using our REST APIs where you'd export, for example, the reference 360 code list and publish that to a dictionary in CDQ. So that can certainly be accomplished. Let's see, we had a question also on the history of changes. I believe we did answer that during the presentation on the history screen. So you can see not only the changes to the reference data set itself, like adding a column or deleting a column, but also to individual values. And you can see that a little timeline view where this person added this value at this time. So it's pretty useful, and it was enhanced in the June 2022 release. We talked a bit about the workflows. Creator, reviewer, approver, and deployment was the suggestion in the Q&A, and it is similar to that. We have the reference data set creator. We have a reviewer or approver that would really be the business stakeholder. They can approve changes. And as a deployment, you could think of someone who's able to, like a service account that has access to execute the export API. That would be useful for a deployment role. And yeah, for the development lifecycle, we did talk a little bit about CI/CD and GitHub. At the moment, my understanding is the reference 360 does not have a direct link with GitHub and similar products, but we do have that for CI/CD for CAI and CDQ and CDI, other services. So those kinds of integrations would be managed through GitHub. And you could, for example, you could design a process using the REST API that would automate that export from dev and import to test kind of mechanism. So that can be done, but it's not out of the box yet. There was one more question on, is there any existing integration with the EDC products from Informatica? My understanding is that there is not. There's not an existing EDC connector. That's a good question for our EDC group. We can raise that internally. But what I would expect is that a connector could be created that would just use our REST API to, for example, to export code lists as here's a list of the available code lists, that kind of metadata. I know there's also data profiling that can be done using Amazon EMR through the Parquet file that would contain the data dictionaries. So that can be done as well. I hope that's answering your question. Okay, let's see. Oh, there was a question on ActiveBoss workflows in reference 360. It actually it doesn't use ActiveBoss, at least not in the traditional sense that we would use in MDM MDE, for example. There is a workflow capability with reference 360, but it's not as capable of ActiveBoss. It's not as flexible. It's essentially just a multi-step workflow where each step is a different person that can either reject back to the sender or can accept it, and it goes to the next step in the list. So it's quite simple. I ran out of time during today's webinar to do as part of the recording, but I will include some slides in the PowerPoint that we should have available after this webinar. And in that, there's a demo on. It's just a slide-based demo, starting from I think it's slide 43, that goes through an example of how that multi-step workflow exactly works. But to answer your question, it's not strictly speaking, it's not actually ActiveBoss. It almost certainly it is in the background. It's just that we don't expose it to users. There was another question about concatenation rules, and I do apologize if I'm going too quickly. I just wanted to make sure we finished on time. Yeah, I think this would probably be an advanced rule, because I think the basic rule can only work on one column at a time. But an advanced rule, for example, if you had a maplet in CDI and defined that using CDQ, define that as a rule, then you could have the code value automatically concatenated. But if I'm understanding the question correctly, I think a basic rule can only operate on one column at a time. So you'd have to use an advanced rule for that, but it can be done. Yeah. And then, sorry, the final question was about confidentiality. Oh, sorry, there's another one that just popped in. Confidentiality, it's not about restricting code values or columns. It's only who can access which lists, code lists. So, for example, if I have read-only access to a code list, then I can read all values and all columns in that code list. So the security is much more simple than we might be used to, for example, with MDM multi-domain, or even for Customer 360 SaaS. For example, there wouldn't be a tax column that we would hide in reference data. That would be something that we would do in master data, but in reference data, we usually would not have something that specific as a security requirement. So the confidentiality isn't really masking. It's just who can access what, who can make changes, who can see each list, who can approve changes, that kind of thing. And yeah, so the last question was on the export of code values from code lists. You can only get one list at a time. At least that's the way I've seen it. And then there's, so when you're in the CDI example we were looking at, you have I made a filter just on the code list, and as part of that API call in the third step, you transfer that list value just as a one-time parameter to the export operation, and the export gives you all values in that one particular code list. I don't think there's a way to export all code values from all code lists in one shot. And in practice, you might want to do that when you're doing CI/CD, but during normal processing, you wouldn't need to do that, right? During normal publish operations, as soon as a code value or a change to the reference list is published and approved, then you'd want that to flow through just that one change, not necessarily even the entire code list. So that should work, but you're right. You're right in thinking that for CI/CD, that capability would be useful. I hope that answers your question. For the final, okay, we've got one more question. Is there a way to migrate on-premise MDM to MDM cloud? There's no easy way for that. It's a good question. there's no built-in connector for that kind of thing. What you can do, though, is export your values from an on-premise MDM into a CSV file or whatever's convenient, and then import that into Reference 360. So you'd have to do it, again, you'd have to do it one at a time, but it can certainly be done that way. And that gives you the opportunity to explore some of the capabilities as well as you run through that. Like when you import into MDM Cloud, is there a different multi-step workflow for approvals that we'd want to set up, and how should those Reference 360 tables, or in the MDM we would talk about tables, how would that translate to the idea of a reference data set in Reference 360? So for the most part, I believe it would be just an export from MDM and import into the cloud, just as we saw during our demo. We are at time. I'll stay on for a few minutes just to answer what questions I can. I hope that'll be useful. But please feel free to drop if you have another conflict. There was a question here about adding users. Let's see. Yeah, so if I'm understanding your question correctly, yes. The specific users that are part of the Reference 360 data set, you would have to add a user to a role and then allow that role access to that particular reference data set. By default, I think it is only the creator that will have access until you explicitly grant access to specific roles, such as making a user part of the data stewards list or making them part of the read-only list. So yeah, you would have to you'd have to do that individually. And that, of course, would have to be done in each environment. So for dev, for example, it might be a different set of users that you allow read-only access to the test environment or the production environment. That would be something that you'd have to work out as an organization. There's one question about the row-level access to reference data. I think that we touched on that just before. It does not currently support that in the Reference 360 model. Right now, you would have read-only access, but you'd have access to all code values within the list, not a specific list, not a specific subset. So at least for the moment, that's not, row-level access is not supported. That is something that MDE can do, but Reference 360 cannot at this time. Yeah, there was a question from the Reference Data Management Accelerator. Again, there would not be a built-in connector that we could use for that, but it can certainly be done manually. For example, the RDM accelerator that we use with multi-domain, I believe that's no longer being provided for new customers, at least. It is, my understanding, it is still under support. It's just not being provided as an accelerator anymore. We tend to prefer that people consider adopting Reference 360. So if you're doing that migration, then yeah, the easiest way to do it is just to export from RDM and then import as a new code list into Reference 360. Just the same process. So you define your columns, you'd import it as a CSV, you make sure everything maps correctly, and then you can define your stakeholders, and everything can be done in Reference 360. But essentially, the RDM would only be used as a source of information. It wouldn't be, we wouldn't be able to migrate the roles and so on. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for your participation. I'm sorry to have gone over time. I hope everyone has a great day and recovers well from the long weekend. Have a great week. Talk to you all soon.